For my 10-week project, I decided to try knitting. I thought that this would be a good project for me because it's something I have never done before, but I remember watching my grandmother doing it very often when she would watch me as a child. After deciding on knitting, I then had to get started by finding my materials. I wasn't really sure how to go about this since I didn't know what materials would be proper, but I decided to get 10-inch aluminum needles that were a size 11 off of Amazon. I didn't really know what the sizing meant, but I could tell through the picture that they were a little bit thicker needles, which I thought would be easier since I wouldn't have to have a really tight scarf. It might make it easier, it might make it go by a little quicker. I then got a type of thicker yarn. Again, I thought that would be easier to grip and to go about my knitting at the beginning. And the only other materials I needed was a pair of scissors. When the needles came in, I was pretty happy with them. Same with the yarn. I thought it was a good type of yarn to use. After getting my materials to get started, I then had to learn how to cast on. This process ended up being quite challenging for me. I looked on YouTube, watched a lot of videos, and also looked at pictures since I'm a visual learner. I was surprised at how many different ways you can cast on, which I found to be a little bit confusing because I didn't know the way which would be easiest for me. However, looking at all my options, I decided to go with the long tail cast on, which is shown in the picture presented right now. And so for this, you take your yarn and you pull out a long piece as long as you think the first row you want to be, and you just loop that over your needle, and then you take your thumb and your index finger and wrap the string around so you kind of have this weird looking web, and then you take the tip of your needle and you go under the string off your thumb and then over the string on your index finger and pull it through, and you get this sort of slip knot. And then you just continue doing that for the length of the string you cut, as many as you want to knit in the first row. Once I had casted on, it was time to start knitting my first project. I decided to do 10 loops. Originally, that meant I casted on 10 different stitches to knit off of. At first, I found it was pretty challenging. I had to put a lot of focus into what I was doing with each stitch. I didn't want to lose them or drop them. So I was getting a little frustrated at the beginning, especially I found that I was pulling a little too tight. So my first few rows were very tight, which made it harder to start a new row because then the loop was too tight for my needle to fit under. However, as I got going, I got the hang of it more and more, and the latter half of the scarf ended up being a lot quicker to do as I got in the swing of it. However, I did notice that I had made several mistakes, which you can see in the images shown. I dropped a few stitches early on, which made some holes in my scarf, and I also somehow added on a lot of extra stitches. So I started with a width of 10 and I ended up somehow with a width of 20 stitches, which made my scarf kind of curve out a lot. I found it kind of frustrating to move forward as I was disappointed with the first half of my scarf, and it really didn't look that great. However, I was happy that I was getting the hang of it, and I knew that this kind of just encouraged me to get onto my second scarf so I could make it look that much better. After completing scarf number 1, which took several weeks and was by far the most challenging scarf I made, I started on scarf number 2. For this scarf, I used the same type of yarn as I did with the first one because I thought it would be easier and more familiar. This scarf took half the time and I was much more pleased with the way it turned out. I then made 2 more scarves, each with a little bit different type of yarn. One was a little thinner and one was a little thicker. For the thinner one, I noticed that while casting on and beginning to stitch, the stitches were much more tight and it was a little bit more challenging. For the thicker yarn, although it was easier and it came along much faster, I had made it the same width as my other scarves, and I was unaware how much the extra thickness of the scarf would add, and because of this, I ended up actually making my scarf much shorter than I had anticipated because I ended up running out of yarn. I found that while making these additional scarves, it became more of a habit rather than a chore. I no longer was paying direct attention to each stitch I made, but I rather could multitask and focus on other things while knitting. After making 4 scarves, I decided I wanted to try something a little new, so I decided I was going to make some headbands. The concept of making the headbands was quite similar to making the scarves, so it was pretty easy to catch on. One of the harder parts was determining appropriate width to make my headband when casting on. The first one I made was too wide, the second one I made was too thin, but finally I got a good width on my third one. Because the headbands need to be sewed together at the end to make them more of a complete circle so they can be worn on someone's head, I need to figure out how to sew them together properly. However, I was unable to get to this part of my project, so I'm hoping to maybe be able to learn how to do this or find someone to help me do this over break so I can give them as some Christmas gifts. Throughout the past 10 weeks, I've had a love hate relationship with this knitting project. At the beginning, I saw this as a chore or a part of my day that I had to do rather than something I wanted to do. In the beginning, it was super tedious and I had to pay a lot of attention to what I was doing, and it took a lot of concentration. However, as I got more comfortable, I started to see it more as a leisure activity of my day and something that was a good way to de stress at the end of a long day. I could knit while I was laying in bed or watching a movie, and it really started to shift into something I was enjoying and that I like to do. Overall, I thought this project was really unique in the way that it forced me to be outside my comfort zone and try something new that I have not done before, which allowed me to see some of the frustrations and challenges that go along with that process. Because of this, I do have a greater appreciation for what it's like to be someone in these situations, whether you're a client or someone who's just has to try something new or be outside of your familiarities. So I think that this really helped to open my eyes to what it's like to be in these situations and how challenging and frustrating it can be at times.